revolution which we said would issue from the war in Europe is not taken off the agenda. You see, they had said the war would produce revolution. Well, there's no revolution. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Like an equation, you take this away from this and that. There's no revolution on this side of the equation. That means the war can't have finished. That is literally how they thought, which shows you that they had completely abandoned the method, if they'd ever understood it. That was the problem with these people. They had not understood the method of Marxism. They had not understood the method of Trotsky. And then they went on to make mistake after mistake. We had a discussion on China and Maoism before. First, they said Mao could not take power and would betray. When he did take power, suddenly they discovered that he was an unconscious Trotskyist. You read Ted, explains that what was coming to power in China, first of all, he predicted they would come to power because it was evident from the facts. But once in power, he said it's basically a Stalinist regime with a bureaucracy. And the masses of China will need to carry out a second political revolution to move towards genuine communism, i.e. remove the bureaucracy. There's a document called The Reply to David James, Spring 1949, by Ted Grant. He says this: while a genuine revolutionary Trotskyist leadership in a backward country would draw its strength from the proletariat, welding the peasant masses behind it, Mao rests on the peasantry and not only bases himself on the passivity of the proletariat at this stage, but ruthlessly suppresses the proletarians who dare take measures against the bourgeoisie on the basis of independent class action. At a later stage, Mao will lean on the proletariat when he needs it against the bourgeoisie, only later to betray and ruthlessly suppress it. This is the Marxist approach to that phenomenon while it's happening, not 20 years later. It's very good to have the hindsight. I can't go into all the details. They did it again with Tito in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia first was a capitalist country, then suddenly it became a relatively healthy worker state. And again, in spring 1949, on the question of what would happen between China and Russia, he says, he actually predicted the Sino-Soviet split, but now I have to rush because I've just been told I've got a lot less time on my hands. Now, Ted maintained the ideas, as I've shown here. Was expelled in 1950, was left with about 30 comrades. Can you imagine? You think we're small today. Imagine being an organization with 30 members in one country, at the beginning of the most powerful boom in history, really isolated from the working class, struggling against the stream. Ted Grant and his small group kept going, producing documents, analysis, etc., and had a perspective that capitalism is booming, but like all booms, it will come to an end. And when it comes to an end, there will be a new wave of class struggle. And when that wave of class struggle comes, there will be political changes and a radicalization of the working class. That is what happened in the 70s, comrades. It took about 25 years. They launched the militant in 1964, orientated to the Labour Party, and built a tendency embedded in the Labour Party, in the youth of the Labour Party, and built up a strong tendency. That's what I joined. Bought a paper on the street, and that was the end of it. My life changed ever since. I don't regret 1 second doing that. But lots of people were recruited in the 70s on the basis of that period. The perspectives were confirmed, and there was a huge influx of workers and youth into the mass organizations. The trade unions were doubling their members, the workers' parties were growing everywhere, and with it, left-wing currents were emerging in many different countries. On the back of this process, we started to build an international in the 1970s, which was launched in 1974, with the members which I listed earlier on. But very quickly, we started to grow. I remember Alan Woods went to Spain. When I joined, Alan was on his way to Franco, Spain. I was reading the internal bulletins. Not like you guys, you get it every bloody week on an email. This came out every 3-6 months, and it was a printed thing. But it was reports about how we were developing the work in Spain, in the underground, under Franco. We were making contacts in Sri Lanka, making contacts in many other countries. I remember, you think, what have you got to do if you're a Marxist? You go and build where it's necessary. I joined the organization. We had nothing in Italy. I could speak Italian. My job is to build in Italy. I went to Italy in 1977, and we started to build with very small forces. Can you imagine selling the paper on a demonstration, and you are literally the only one selling the paper, and they say to you, I've already got it. And I say, can't be. And then they say, why, are you the only one? Oh, sorry, yeah, you obviously bought it off the other comrades. Couldn't admit to be on your own. Lots of comrades did that, went to different countries, recruited in Britain, and started to build the international. Now, that international grew through the 70s and the 80s. But again, history tends to repeat itself, not exactly the same way. But you see, the wave of class struggle of the 70s really started to peter out by the end of the 70s and early 80s. By the time you get to the middle of the 80s, the miners' strike in Britain, for instance, was like a big last gasp of the class struggle. Incredible strike of insurrectionary proportions. Battles with the police, a year-long strike. A huge battle took place. And the Tories invested massively in that. How did they invest? Billions in policing and preparing the ground to defeat the miners. Defeat the miners, and you send a message to the rest of the working class that the class struggle is finished and cannot be successful. It wasn't just the miners. The Fiat workers in Italy in 1980 were defeated after a long strike. The PATCO union in the States, Reagan smashed the air controllers union. This was being repeated in country after country after country. That wave of class struggle came to an end, in effect, by the mid-80s. The objective situation started to change. A shift to the right took place in several countries. The rise of the Tories in this country, Thatcherism dominated. It was a general, I mean, I'm simplifying, obviously. It wasn't like this in every single country exactly the same time. But in this period of a decade or so, you had a fall in union membership, a fall in strikes. You look at the statistics. In Italy, the strikes from a huge level of 69, 70, 72, they collapsed to historical lows. Britain, 72, on the verge of a general strike, massive strike wave. My dad, he was in a strike, 7-week strike. It was normal in those days to have your parents doing that, coming home and getting a daily strike report from your dad who'd been on the picket line. This was what was happening. That was transformed into its opposite. And by the end of the 80s, things had radically changed. This was combined with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This all had an effect on consciousness. The idea that communism has failed. Of course, we know what had actually failed. But in the minds of millions of people, it was communism that had failed. Socialism wasn't possible. The class struggle has failed. We've tried and tried and tried, and we've achieved nothing. The Labour Party shifts to the right. The left is emptied out. The unions start to go down. Again, a change in the objective situation. It was necessary to understand that. Unfortunately, the majority leadership of the militant drew the conclusion that it was up and away, the red 90s, we've entered the red 90s, etc. When actually in reality, the objective situation had changed in a negative sense. I can remember in the middle of that split, we had the Italian section having their conference with a couple of British comrades coming to speak. And some of the young comrades said to me, Fred, are these full-timers at the International? I said, yeah, I'm sorry. They're on an incredibly low level and disorientated the organization. But more importantly, the political level of the organization was going down. Less attention was being paid to that. It was all action and campaigning. There was a battle to be had in 1991, 92 in that organization, and we had that battle. Again, I can't go into the details. There is an article called How the Militant Was Built and How It Was Destroyed by Rob Sewell. I think it's on the website. You can go and read it and study it to get a much clearer picture of that. But just to give you an idea, in 1970, we published a document called Program of the International, written by Ted. It's on the website. This is the theoretical basis upon which that international had been created, and then, of course, was partially destroyed by the antics of the majority of the militant at the time. We came out of that split with a much smaller organization. I think, on memory, we had comrades in about 12 countries. Several sections came wholly on the side of Alan and Ted in that faction fight. Others split. The Italian section, to my personal pleasure, came 100% with Ted. We didn't give the Taffites one toehold. And to this day, they have hardly anything, which is still something when I'm sitting at home having a little, my port or my wine, I enjoy thinking about and enjoying it. Now, we can't be too sectarian here, but I am pleased. We went through that battle, and some people think it was about the Labour Party. In actual fact, that wasn't the key element. They still think that's what it was about. That's why they can't understand what we're doing. It was an element. We had built up a strong position in the Labour Party, and we could have held on to some of those positions. But nobody disagreed with the idea the Labour Party had moved to the right, and we needed to do more open work, more open youth work, etc. But it was the theoretical education which was being abandoned. For instance, the militant closed the education department at one stage. They didn't consider it an important department. We think it was a key department. That's an indication of where they were going. And it's reflected to this day in the difference between us and the Socialist Party. But we turned towards rebuilding the organization after 1991, 92. And we thought we'd base ourselves on our strong points, the theoretical strength of the organization. That's why, for instance, we published a book called Reason and Revolt. Now, you might think, what's the point of writing a book about science and Marxism? Well, I'm telling you, at that time, it played a huge role internally in the organization because it showed the comrades that we have ideas. It's not just about wages and conditions. It's not just about a 35-hour week or whatever. Marxism has a lot to say about everything. We do. We can talk about anything. Science, history, whatever. And this showed how 100 years of scientific discoveries had confirmed the philosophy of Marxism, dialectical materialism. You lose grasp of dialectical materialism as a method, you are lost as an organization. Trotsky explained that many times to the leadership of the American section. He didn't quite grasp it. You must study dialectical materialism, study historical materialism. You've got to have an understanding of Marxist philosophy if you're going to build a powerful communist organization, which we did. And then we started gradually to recover. We started to rebuild. We had lost most of what we had in the Americas. But you see how you can build with ideas and method. I remember in 1998, a young lad in his 20s called John Peterson in London came across us. He was very interested in that, in Reason and Revolt, which shows you can build with those ideas. We won him to the organization. One comrade went back to the States. Can you imagine? One in the United States. By then, of course, the internet was starting to come on board, making it a little bit easier. You got it easy, you guys. Not like when I was building. You actually had to literally print the paper and sell it. Went back, gradually started building up the first nucleus. 5, 10 people, 20 people. The same happened in Canada, one British comrade, and in other sections too. And then we started making contacts with groups. Like in Switzerland, we met a group, an organized group, with a few funny ideas to begin with. But we sorted them out. You know, the good ones from those that are not so good. Gradually making contacts, building up the organization. With these ideas and methods, from one in America, we've gone to over 600. In Canada, you heard the report, we're going towards the 700. We are building in section after section. In Italy, they're going to have a seminar on Lenin in the middle of December to prepare next year. They're going to celebrate, I'm sure they're going to celebrate the 500 at that seminar. The French are growing. Everywhere, the organization is now growing, but it took those decades of preparation, which combined theoretical preparation, the documents, the articles. You read the material. There's a wealth of material and books out there that we've educated the comrades on, plus the method of building. We have had many different ways of working, and we're very flexible. We've had entrism, full-on entrism, like in the Labour Party, dominated the Labour Party Young Socialists. We even had MPs, Labour MPs. That we did, having done the work of the Revolutionary Communist Party during the Second World War, when it was necessary to have a much more open approach, an independent approach. Then we had a period where we were orientating to the mass organizations, but orientating, not doing much there because there wasn't much to be done. And we did our own independent youth work. That's the period of the Marxist societies, which paid off really well, really successful work. Now we've reached a point where if you have to take it to a higher level. Now we are in a situation very similar, no, it's not exactly the same, similar to what Ted Grant faced in the Second World War, with an open revolutionary communist identity. That's why the Brazilian comrades are now calling themselves the Internationalist Communist Organization. We'll see what others do. I have some ideas, but we will discuss them in the coming period. This is a brief 40-minute history of this organization. There's a lot you could read and develop more on, but this is fundamentally what the IMT is. And to go back to what I said at the beginning, we have sections in many countries. We have started to develop in Chile. We've got an organization in Mexico, in Colombia, South Africa, we developed recently. Sri Lanka, we have contacts. We are really spreading globally as a tendency. And our task is to rebuild Lenin's Communist International. What it will be called, we will see, but that is the model upon which we must base ourselves and work towards building big forces in country after country. That is the answer to the question, how do you avoid degeneration and bureaucracy? You don't limit yourself to a national outlook, you have an internationalist approach. You fight for communism in every country on a global scale. That will finally achieve the final victory of communism on this planet and will transform it and prepare the future of humanity. Not to do that, you know what the alternative is. Just look at Gaza. When you talk about barbarism, bombing hospitals, killing thousands of children, and justifying it. Today, they're remembering, as Alan said, is it today or tomorrow? Today, they're remembering the dead of previous wars, i.e., they're remembering the young men that they sent to be butchered to defend their system, while they justify wars today which are still defending their system. This is the barbarism that this system creates. It doesn't have to be like that, but it depends on you, comrades.
Well, comrades, as Grace said just now, genuine Marxism is about starting with a concrete and scientific analysis of material reality. We don't start with schemas or dogmatic rules and apply them to what we see. And Ted Grant understood this more than anyone else, really. And in fact, Ted was the only Marxist, actually, at the time who fully understood and appreciated the post-war boom and the effects on Western capitalist nations after World War II. And everyone else, including all the official leaders of the Fourth International, they made mistake after mistake. They flipped from dogmatism to impressionism in their attempts to understand what was going on. They were the ones who took Trotsky's conditional 1938 perspective and they applied it like a rigid dogma to events. They called for crisis and Bonapartism, where the conditions had clearly changed and economic recovery was on the cards. And then, after that, when they realized they were wrong, they succumbed to the pressure of objective reality of the situation and their own lack of understanding. And they did a complete U-turn. And one after the other, they argued that there was something fundamental that had changed about capitalism, which meant basically that they had abolished booms and slumps altogether. Now, all of these ideas were false from start to finish. Ted debunks them systematically in his writings. He puts forward the concrete perspective that capitalist slump is inevitable, and obviously as well that the unprecedented post-war boom that they were living through would be followed by a catastrophic crisis which would shake consciousness to its foundations and open up a new period of revolution. And that prediction was proved absolutely correct in the world crisis of the 1970s. So in 1938, Trotsky stated in his perspectives that capitalism was unable to develop the productive forces any further, and that would lead to a slump following the war and a new wave of revolutions all across the world. And this perspective was, broadly speaking, correct. This did happen. You had a wave of revolutions all over the world, in Greece, in Italy, in France, although the workers' leaders betrayed them. You also had revolutionary waves in Africa, Latin America, and in Asia as well. But of course, Trotsky's 1938 perspectives, they were always conditional. Perspectives are always conditional for Marxists. And they were falsified by the victory and the massive strengthening of Stalinism, which really provided the basis for a revival of capitalism. And I would say that's one of the main factors which gave the capitalists space and room to re-establish the situation. And that laid the foundations for the economic recovery. But after Trotsky's death, I know. We should be living under socialism. But after Trotsky's death, the leaders of the Fourth International, Mandel, Pablo, Frank, Hansen, and others, they could not understand any of this. They just repeated Ted's writings by rote without understanding what was actually taking place. And they argued there would be an immediate economic crisis, there would be wars, revolutions, Bonapartist dictatorships. And Ted was the only person that understood the new situation. So one of the results of the barbarism of World War II was a massive destruction of the productive forces all across Europe and all across Asia. And of course, there were tens of millions of deaths as well. Now, that destruction was unprecedented within history. And the ruling class today, they still think back to those times because they are afraid of the social and the political consequences of that level of destruction in the economy, which is why they take measures to try and avoid that, which I'll get onto a bit later. Now, factories and industry was destroyed within the process of the war, and they had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Now, sometimes the capitalists call this creative destruction, and it does give the system room to grow into it. But at the same time, again, as I mentioned, the political factors, the social cost of this destruction is a wave of revolutions which threaten to overthrow capitalism if they are successful. Now, that's why we always have to emphasize the betrayal of these revolutions by the Stalinist leaders, by the reformist workers' leaders. That created the conditions for the economic revival. And because that wave of revolutions after World War II was defeated, American imperialism in particular was able to come in and play a huge role in reconstructing the capitalist economy through the Marshall Plan and other things. So in this period, you had vast amounts of state expenditure that was used to prop up and stabilize capitalism. The bourgeois leaned on the workers' leaders and organizations to carry out counter-revolution in a democratic form. They were not able in this period to rely on fascism or Bonapartism due to the class balance of forces. They would threaten another revolutionary movement. And the result of this was a period of economic growth, a sustained period of economic growth. By definition temporary, but it was a serious period. And of course this happened without the working class having been defeated as a force. And it's important to remember as well that it is true that this was a historical period of economic growth, but this idea of growth in capitalism being based on prior destruction of the productive forces, this is not something new or unique. It has happened in the past as well. In fact, Ted, if you read his writings, he talks about this happening during the world crisis of 1929 to 1933. By 1938, the productive figures had actually exceeded the record years in 1928 to 1929 in most countries of the world because of that prior destruction of the productive forces. So capitalism, in this chaotic, unbalanced manner, it destroys excess productive capacity. It wipes out stock values, industry, conditions of the working class, and wages are also part of this destruction as well, in order to start again at a lower point. So Ted explains that these wars, right, these periods of destruction have the same effect as a capitalist crisis. The ruin, the destruction, the wearing out of consumer and capital goods, it paves the way for a period of recovery, but in an incredibly intensified form. So that is why we say that there is no absolute limit to the development of the means of production under capitalism, in the sense that no Marxist has ever said there will be literally no development of the productive forces ever again in the future. There can always be development under capitalism, but the question to ask is not, will there be recovery in the future? Will there be development? But at what cost will there be recovery? What has to happen first in order for this boom, in order for this development to take place? So the question that Ted asked in Will There Be a Slump? He says, are there any new features of capitalism after World War II, such as state intervention or anything else, that has fundamentally changed the nature of capitalism? And the answer is, of course, no. Capitalism is a system where commodity production and exchange dominate society. A commodity is a thing which is produced by the capitalists for the market, not for their own consumption. They sell these commodities for profit, and in the course of capitalist production, the profits of the capitalists come from the exploitation of the working class. The workers' wage that they are paid does not cover the full value of what they produce, and in the working day, they create surplus value, extra value, which is pocketed by the capitalists. It's accumulated, and that forms part of their profits. Now, part of the surplus value is necessarily reinvested into industry to expand capitalist production and to develop the productive forces further in order to make more profit. They want to become more productive, they want to produce more goods, they want to sell more, they want to receive more profits that way. And you have the situation of competition between capitalists all across the country and all across the world in this drive for more profits, which is fueling this process. So capitalism cannot continue to exist without continually revolutionizing the means of production, driving up profits, which means producing more and selling more. And due to the wages of the working class on a collective level not being enough to represent the full value of what the working class produce in the course of production, there is an anarchic and a chaotic race between capitalists to produce and to sell commodities. So overproduction is inherent within the system, and overproduction of commodities is the root cause of crisis under capitalism. You know, not with...
Be back tomorrow. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I recently got laid off for going on strike, so you can check out the details and help me out if you like. But this will